Yep, that's right. If you haven't heard the news yet, then chances are by the time you're watching this video, Concord is pretty much already dead. The official PlayStation blog just released an article talking about how they are officially taking the game offline as of the 6th of September while they quote-unquote explore new options. And I just want to say real quick that I 100% totally called this in my last video. Can someone please roll the clip? Of course, being Concord, funnily enough. That game is, after all, bound to die within a matter of months at this rate, unless they pull some kind of Uno reverse plan to unrelease the game and try again in another year. So yeah, this is a relatively new strategy in the games industry that Sony is employing that many people like to call unreleasing your game. It's not used very often. I do recall Amazon Game Studios employed it a couple of times, and while the way the Multiverses beta was handled I don't think technically qualifies, it certainly feels like it was unreleased, but either way, Concord is now the latest game to have the honor of being unreleased. And so, I just wanted to ask one question, which is, where can Concord possibly go from here? Like, can they actually turn things around and somehow make this game successful? Because while yes, it can be fun to point and laugh at a AAA studio managing to achieve literally unprecedented levels of failure, I do want to be somewhat constructive here. I mean, I won't deny having joined in on some of the schadenfreude of the situation myself, but I mean, ultimately, it would be nice if games were good, and the only way that more games will be good in the future is if we learn from our past mistakes. After all, I don't think that a game deserves to fail, let alone a second time, though that is provided that it is willing to try and learn and fix its problems. Because of course, no game inherently deserves success either, and they have a long road ahead of them if they want to earn it. So, to start with, I do have to say that I think that unreleasing the game is the correct first step. There is not really any point in continuing to support the game and keep it live when the active player count is at risk of dipping into the double digits, if not lower. Just from a purely logistics standpoint, it's going to be easier to update a game when you don't have to worry about accidentally messing up the live public version. But on top of that, this will also make it easier to transition the game to something like a free-to-play model. I know that I harped on the character designs in my last video, and I do still believe that those are the number one issues with the game, but the price tag of $40 is definitely the second biggest issue with the game, when their direct competition are games like Overwatch, Marvel Rivals, and Deadlock, which are all already or will be free-to-play games. And to their credit, they are also refunding every single person that bought the game, which I think helps remove any kind of potential awkwardness that might have come had they just tried to reduce the game's price so soon after launch. And that's something that's a lot easier to do when they are just straight up taking the game down instead of awkwardly trying to keep it alive for just that little bit longer. Plus, by taking the game down like this, it also means that they can just generally make much more big, wide, sweeping changes where they might try to rebuild some systems from the ground up rather than releasing smaller, more regular patches. And I think that that's going to be necessary if this game wants to have any kind of hope for the future. So yeah, other than completely reworking the monetization structure to even give it a chance at life, what else can they do to actually, make this game possibly succeed? Well, like I just said, I do think that the number one existing problem is 100% the god-awful character designs, and just more generally the overall art style of the game. I already went into length about why these character designs are bad in my previous video, so link in the description if you want to go back and check that out in full. But to summarize, they basically need to be focusing on better conveying what a character actually does, as well as tying some aspect of their actual personality and character traits into their physical design. Not to mention, just generally trying to make the characters at least somewhat appealing to look at with things like more interesting color choices and whatnot. If a character can fly, maybe give them a visible jetpack or other means of propulsion. If a character can shoot fire out of their hands, maybe give them literally anything in their design that indicates that they can somehow manipulate fire, etc., etc. etc. They don't have to necessarily change the characters themselves if they're that attached to them. Like, John Concord over here can continue being John Concord if they really want to keep him that way. Just maybe give him some actually interesting looking tactical gear and some armor instead of just slapping him in a t-shirt with some weird plastic crap taped to him. Though if they do want to change any specific characters themselves, I do think that some of the aliens could maybe use some tweaks to make them look more interesting and unique. Knockoff Drax over here, I feel, just does not look super great on his own, and many people, including myself, have shared the opinion that if the lizard guy actually looked like a proper lizard with like an actual snout and everything, that he would look way more fun and interesting than he does now, where he just kind of looks like a weirdly realistic human that's covered in lizard makeup. But that does also lead me to the next thing that they might rework, which, like I said, is the game's just overall art style as a whole. Making the characters look cooler is one thing, but I still feel like it's kind of silly for this game about a huge group of people with big fancy high-tech quasi-magical abilities to have this really drab realistic art style. For comparison, there's a trailer for Concord that still uses 3D models but has a filter applied to them to give it a more 2D cel-shaded style, and just taking one glance at the comments, you will see tons of people sharing the same opinion that these shorts look so much more interesting than the boring realistic artwork of the actual game itself. Now sure, it's never going to be as simple as just slapping a filter on the models and calling it a day. They would still need to redo a lot of model work and probably some animations and whatnot in order to make this work, but if they can take the art style from these trailers and apply it to the actual game itself, I think it would legitimately give their game a much more unique and interesting look that would actually set it apart from its contemporaries. So if they're going to shut down the game to make these kinds of big sweeping changes, I think that this would be the direction to go in. Moving on to other aspects of the game though, I'll admit, when it comes to the actual gameplay, I don't have a ton I can directly talk about, seeing as, like most people, I didn't actually play the game myself, so all I can really comment on are things that I learned secondhand. That said, there are a few notes I have listed here that are compiled from looking at a number of different reviews for the game. From what I can understand, there's a number of really strange systems in this game that I don't 100% fully understand, and I feel like that they just kind of bog down and overcomplicate the gameplay experience. Like, for one, there's this really weird system where there are multiple copies of each character with slight variance in what each of those versions can do. And this gets used in a handful of game modes in some different ways and whatnot, and I think that this is just kind of a weird system to use in a hero shooter. Typically speaking, hero shooters are generally about very specific characters with very specific fixed sets of abilities. So the idea that you can just kind of play with different versions of the same hero that swaps out some of their abilities kind of feels like it goes against the point of having specific characters in the first place, at least to some degree. And it's not just minor stat changes either. Like, for example, there's multiple versions of Lennox, that's the weird lizard guy, and in one variation, he has a combat roll where he reloads his gun, and in another version, he lacks that ability entirely, but just has more total ammo capacity, so he doesn't have to reload as often in the first place. And like I said, this is just kind of weird because that means that now, even if the lizard guy had a good design that generally conveyed his abilities, now you can't actually know what their current set of abilities are just from a glance because you don't actually know what variant you're playing against. So in my opinion, they should just dump this weird concept and focus on giving their characters a singular, discrete, and concrete kit of abilities that makes them stand out from each other and are easy to remember. And on a similar note, there's also this weird roster system as well as crew bonuses, which a lot of people did not understand when the game first launched. So like, for example, in order to queue up for a game, you have to first build a roster of what characters you would want to be available to you, which acts as like a weird middle ground between a game like TF2 where you can freely swap between any class mid-match, and a game like Deadlock where you're locked into your single character the whole time. Instead, you can freely swap between characters as long as they're on your roster, which can include multiple variants of the same character to tie in with the last weird system, but you're limited to only those characters, and that's it. And again, I just kind of feel like this system is probably not worth keeping, especially for dumping the variant system as well. For one, it's just a lot of busy work that I don't think people just want to do at all. And secondly, the whole point of being able to swap characters mid-match in a game like this is usually that that so that you can fill in the niche that the party is missing, or to try and actively counterpick an opponent who is currently bullying your team. But with the way that this system works, you might have a very limited pool of mercenaries to choose from, and especially when you're playing with a bunch of randos online, you have no way of really coordinating each individual player's roster with one another, so you don't actually know if anybody can even cover the weaknesses in the team or be able to effectively counterpick your opponents. If you don't have a healer in your roster, then you literally can't swap to a healer if the team needs it. It's just a really weird and limiting system that just adds more confusion and busy work to the game. Now, so far, I've only recommended getting rid of mechanics, and that's not super great so far, but I do think that the last unique mechanic Concord has, at least in my notes, is something that I think could be worth preserving in some form, which are the crew bonuses. Now again, when the game was alive, this was a very confusing mechanic that not a lot of people understood, but basically, each character comes with some kind of passive bonus that allows them to buff their allies by simply existing on the team. So, for example, a tanky character could give everyone more base health, or maybe a DPS character might improve everyone's reload times or increase their move speed. It's a way for every character to act as some level of support for the team without necessarily having to actually play as a support dedicated character, and I think that that's a much more interesting way to modify your characters than the variant system. It makes team composition a more interesting puzzle than merely trying to synergize abilities off of each other, especially since while it is still changing what each character's stats are, this does so in a way that enemies can at least understand what's happening in real time by simply looking at the current team comp. The information wouldn't be hidden, unlike how the variant system works. Except, that's actually not at all how the crew bonuses system works. Instead, from what I understand, crew bonuses are actually things that you can only apply to your own characters and not your teammates. Essentially, when you play as a given character in a game mode, you unlock that character's crew bonus. Then, if you swap to another character, you still maintain that first bonus for the rest of the match, while also gaining the second character's bonus, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I really don't like this because for one, it is more ways to modify specific characters, but now it's a lot less obvious what bonuses you have because now you have to try and remember every single character that your opponent has swapped to in the match so far, not just who they're currently playing. And on top of that, it also means that you should just objectively be swapping characters constantly at the start of every game in order to try and amass as many bonuses as possible, which I feel is a bad consequence of this design. Especially since that means that the most optimal thing to do is likely to spend the first few minutes dying as quickly as possible and swapping characters so nobody is going to settle into an actual team comp until everyone has amassed their buffs. Still, I do think that the overall concept is at least somewhat salvageable. Like I said, I think that if this was shifted to be a team-wide passive that only applied for the current character that you are playing, that this would be a way more fun mechanic to use while also being a lot easier to understand. A lot of people mistakenly thought that this was how the mechanic worked to begin with, and there seems to be a universal sense of disappointment that comes with learning how it actually works instead. And this way, you can have actual strategy and synergy with your team composition that you can stick with for a whole match instead of having everyone jump around all over the roster in order to collect their buffs. But, like I said, I never actually played the game myself, so there's not a whole lot more that I can offer in terms of advice on the gameplay. But there is one other thing that I do think the game could do. Concord very much wanted to be a very story-focused game. They were investing heavily in wanting to release new story cutscenes literally every week, not to mention that the episode of that Amazon show, which I am deeply curious to see if it even airs at this point. But I think that just trying to cram in regular cutscenes into the game itself like this is probably not the right way to do it. When people play a hero shooter, they generally want to shoot heroes. That didn't quite come out the way I wanted it to, but the point is that watching cutscenes is typically something that happens outside of the game, like how Overwatch handled its shorts. If they want to incorporate storylines into the game itself, I think they should do so in actual gameplay, such as through a proper PvE mode. I mean, this was something that Overwatch tried to lean into for a while, but it kind of fell through. And the PvE campaign was one of the big aspects of Overwatch 2 that a lot of people were legitimately hyped for. And once you establish a bunch of characters that people actually actually like, people will want to learn more about them and their stories. And I think that offering actual story-related PvE missions in the game itself could be a halfway decent way of combining story and gameplay. They could 100% would not be able to release a new gameplay mission every single week, of course, like they would with these cutscenes, but regular updates of this kind could still be something worth toying around with that, again, would help set it apart from games like Overwatch, who tried but failed to implement such a feature, and Marvel Rivals, who, from what I know, doesn't actually have anything like this at all. Because, like, that's the other thing. Concord does legitimately have plenty of positive aspects to it. Yeah, that's right. I'm actually going to do something that barely anyone commenting on this game has done, which is actually say nice things about Concord. Because let's be real, Concord is absolutely not a 1 out of 10 game. Sure, a lot of people predicted that it wouldn't do well. I counted myself among that crowd too. But pretty much nobody could have predicted that it would do this poorly. And, like, in a world where so many games like Starfield and Anthem and countless others have launched in a state that is clearly unfinished, Concord is at least refreshing for being a fully functional and complete game on release. Sure, it's not great, but at the very least, nobody that I've seen actually play the game has been complaining about things like bugs or terrible netcode or unfinished textures and model work or anything like that. It is at least a refreshingly polished game compared to a lot of the other AAA slop out there. And I mean, a lot of reviews complimented things like the general moment-to-moment gameplay. The guns seem to feel good when you shoot people, and people like the mobility present in the game. Some people commented on liking a few of the more unique game modes, and on top of that, people seem to even really like the writing, so maybe focusing on those PvE story elements could turn out well for them if they focused on keeping that up. Hell, maybe if they're feeling wild, they could release an entire single-player campaign so that people have something to play, even if it does fail again. I mean, am I saying that with these changes that Concord could have gone on to become the next Overwatch? No, I don't think that's going to happen in a million years, but at least maybe it could carve out a moderately sized audience. I mean, people clearly still like hero shooters if Marvel Rivals is any indication, so there's clearly room for playing a new one in the market somewhere out there. It's just that Concord failed to actually entice people to even give it a shot to see if it has any redeeming qualities. Because that's the thing. Concord's worst mistake is just being so aggressively average. The gunplay looks good, but it's not insanely over the top like you would get out of using ultimates in Overwatch. The art style is realistic, but doesn't really have much flair on it, and even the character designs that so many people have harped on, like myself, the main issue is really more that they're just boring and bland than god-awful. But ironically enough, that is arguably worse than being actively bad because it makes them forgettable. Concord, more than anything, needs to sit down and actually pick a lane. Trying to cast the net as wide as possible and appeal to everyone always results in just appealing to nobody. Make the characters more striking, add some more unique gameplay elements, and, maybe not everyone will enjoy these changes, but those that do enjoy them will almost certainly enjoy them more than what we have now. But I think that I might as well leave it there for now, so as always, I am happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. I'm curious to see if anyone else has any other ideas on how this game could possibly come back and succeed, because while I don't believe that any game deserves to fail, it is also true that you must earn success. And of course, it is important to recognize that it is a lot easier to play armchair dev like I am right now after a game comes out and you get to see the public's reaction to its flaws. But if you liked what you saw, make sure to leave me a like and subscribe if you want to see me make more videos like this in the future. Also, I just want to give a quick shout out to one Frosty Krypton for being my first official supporter on Ko-Fi. So, if you want to join them in helping me keep doing what I'm doing and keeping the channel afloat, then there will be a link in the description you can check out, because any amount will help. But, for now, thank you all for watching, and I can't wait to see you all again in the next one.